Hi. So this week we are going to talk about justice, and specifically justice from an Old Testament and New Testament context, I should say. So let's start by defining what the Bible means when it talks about justice. We'll talk about some pertinent biblical passages and kind of introduce those, and then kind of get into the meat of each one of those passages within the subsequent videos. So, first of all, definition. What is justice in this kind of theological matrix? In many ways, justice for the Old Testament and the New Testament is what justice is for us today. There are ways in which justice in the Bible refers to issues of fairness. Related concept is righteousness, and so justice might be related to how one obeys the law, whether one commits murder or theft or adultery or honors the Sabbath. Those Ten Commandment kinds of injunctions, but it also might be how those impact someone else, right? So it's not just that in thievery that you are stealing something that doesn't belong to you, but you're actually like violating covenant. You are violating the relationship of brotherhood, and so justice also has this kind of relational dimension to it in the Bible. I'm going to talk probably a little bit more this week about the Old Testament than the New, but still, the Old Testament informs the New on that issue. But justice also has to do with economic and social parity, right? So that some of those same issues that we talk about today for justice issues, they can be legal, but they can also be moral. And so the Bible thinks this way as well. And when the Bible thinks about that moral kind of justice, it's talking about, it's focusing on, it's thinking about how we get along one with another in society. So, what is justice? It's fairness, to be sure. It is fairness. In the Bible, and certainly when we think about our criminal justice code today, we think about retribution or punishment as well. Well, the Bible has that language in addition to what we have today. The so-called Talion law, that it comes from a Latin term, lex talionis. Talion, T-A-L-I-O-N, is essentially an eye for an eye. So you get as a penalty something equivalent to what you perpetrated. An eye for an eye. You punch out my eye, legally your eye is sacrificed. You punch out my tooth, legally you lose a tooth. You kill me, you lose your life. Now, the conversation often in the Bible, in circles in which we talk about legal dimensions in the Bible, focuses on whether capital punishment is right or wrong. I personally am not a believer in capital punishment. I think Jesus actually supersedes a capital punishment kind of idea. But be that as it may, people disagree about this. In the Old Testament, and certainly at the time of the New Testament, it is practiced this kind of retributive justice. We have the same kind of thing today. You steal, there's a punishment for that. It's retributive, and the effort is to for that retribution to be equal across socioeconomic, racial, ethnic, class, and across jurisdictions. So if my home state is Missouri, so that if I steal a car in Missouri, if I commit the same act in California, that the penalty for my theft would be roughly equivalent. Well, there are all kinds of ways in which that breaks down, and that's a big problem, but that is basically Talion law. You are punished according to the severity of the crime that you committed. And again, in the Old Testament, the parallel term is righteousness. So the word for justice is mishpat. The word for righteousness is tzedakah. And the idea with righteousness is that you are acting rightly toward your brother or toward your sister. There is that kind of relational dimension to it. So a very interesting text is in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 7, where he talks about the difference between righteousness and violence, right? I went out, I was looking for righteousness, and what do I find? Bloodshed. Well, in that way, bloodshed is the exact opposite of righteousness. And what the prophet is bemoaning is this loss of a just society. And it's not a legal kind of justice there in terms of crime and punishment. It is a legal kind of justice that the prophet bemoans in terms of how people across class division are treated. This is something that the prophets in the Old Testament are especially concerned about. And we're going to talk about a couple of texts in which that is front and center, the prophet's concern. So justice is about equality and fairness, but it's also about equity for the poor, so that those who have more means do not have more justice. Okay? And of course, this is a conversation that we have going on in the United States today and across the world, and certainly I'm sure it impacts your area of practice as well. So the passages from the Bible that we're going to look at, there are 6 of them. And I'll deal with each one in a subsequent video. A passage in Deuteronomy chapter 16. Deuteronomy is the 5th book in the Old Testament. 3 passages in Isaiah 11. I've already mentioned Isaiah 5:7. It's not one of the ones that we'll deal with in a subsequent lecture, but certainly that idea in Isaiah 5:7 I think informs these other passages. There are about 4 different passages in Amos 5. Amos is another one of the prophets. One passage or one verse in Micah chapter 6, that's verse 8, which happened to have been the university passage for Azusa Pacific University in 2017-18. Then a passage in Luke chapter 2, this is the Magnificat, Mary's utterance once she finds out that she will be giving birth to the Messiah. And then a narrative in Acts chapter 6, and that deals specifically with a racial justice kind of issue. So all of that is, that's fodder for our conversation this week. And just to maybe be even a little bit clearer, when we think about justice in the Old Testament, we often think about it as a corrective to abuse, the abuse of justice and the abuse of relationship. So with that then comes in this dimension that we'll deal with the last week of class, and that's covenant. When we violate it, an Old Testament way of thinking, when we violate our brother or our sister, we're not just violating them as kind of separate entities. They are part of us. We're violating ourselves in some way. We are violating the covenant relationship that we have with one another as outlined in the Old Testament books. So we'll come back in a moment and we'll deal with Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 18 through 20.